Hello everyone, welcome to our Tuesday sew along. Today we're going to be working on block number 4 of our blockbuster blocks. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about where to find the patterns, where to find the information about cutting, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that later. I also wanted to share with you, I did get my New York Beauty blocks together. Mine will grow up to be a table runner, and I'm probably going to put a couple more rows on it so it's 3 blocks wide and 7 or 8 blocks long, so that I can put it across my table, across the middle of my table. And of course, you don't have to choose fall colors. I named mine Autumn in New York just because of the time frame and the fabrics that I chose. You could do Christmas, you could choose springtime colors. You could also choose some color that matches the decor in your house. So the picture on the left is my Autumn in New York Beauty blocks. And the class is to show you my method of paper piecing, foundation paper piecing, and curve piecing. So that's coming up. You have your choice of either Saturday, October 29th, or Thursday, November 3rd. And you can do the class either via Zoom or here at the shop. And then the one in the middle is the Morning Star quilt. That's a class that's coming up. So we have that one also as an option. And the one on the right is the Southwest Serenade. And it is a class that uses the wing clipper, the tucker trimmer, and the square tools. So that one uses those tools that we've been using here in the shop. The one in the middle, the Morning Star quilt, uses the wedge star tool. That's one of the Studio 180 Design specialty star tools, and those are both available here at the shop. And then the paper piecing one, basically the only tool you really have to have is your paper foundation, and we'll talk in class about how to get that. And then I do recommend the add a quarter ruler for paper piecing, and I show you how to use that. We have those here at the shop as well. So anything I show you, we have available. We have all of the patterns and technique sheets and tools for the Studio 180 Design tools. And then also I posted earlier today on Instagram and Facebook new fabrics that have just come in. So be sure and stop by the shop and see them. And by the way, I don't always post everything that comes in because we also got a nice stack of tone-on-tone fabrics to go in the room where all of our color wall fabrics are. So those aren't on posted, but they are here in the shop for you to enjoy and see. So today's block is the number 4 block. It is called Capital T Variation, and I have a page to show you. This is the pattern that you download from Studio 180 Design's website, and I just printed it out on ink save, so it's not very dark, but if you of course could print it darker. The reason I encourage you to go find those patterns, there's actually a couple of reasons. One is there are options of colors that you could choose over on the side of the information. There's also some text about how the block is used and what tools you need and that sort of thing. Then there's also a chart of options of sizes you could choose. Now, all of the blocks we're using for the Blockbuster Bash that we're using for this series, we're using for 12-inch finished block size. And in this chart, it will tell you what size your units need to be in order to have a 12-inch finished block. There's also a couple of icons down here that show you what shapes you're making. And so that relates to the amounts of fabric that I recommend on the cutting instruction sheet. So they kind of go hand in hand. If you're getting the emails from me at the end of the post, then I started putting a link to download the information I'm giving you for what you need to cut, but also a link for where to find that block that I just showed you, that pattern I just showed you. So our block for today is called Double T Variation. So this is my version, and I've got the sections pieced together, but I haven't completed the block, and I'll be doing that later on this week. And by the way, I'm here by myself. Well, Cliff is here, but Tony's not here, so she's not watching your comments. So if I don't answer a comment, my machine doesn't show me any comments for today. You know, who knows why it does that. So I will answer any comments that you make later, because I can go back and look at them. But I wanted to show you the project for today, or the block for today. So I did have a little note up there to download any of the Blockbuster patterns. Go to studio180design.net and scroll to free downloads, and then scroll to Blockbusters, and they're in number order. And remember, I'm not necessarily going to do all, I think there's 73 of them now. So I'm going to pick the ones that work the best with the fundamental tools and that are doable in a 12-inch block. And so those are the ones that we're going to be downloading. The picture is showing the variation of the double T block that we'll be doing, and basically in the colors that I chose. Now, of course, you could use any color you want to, but I also wanted to show you what a traditional double T block looks like. So it looks, that T's are more apparent, I guess is the best way to say that. They're kind of at an angle, and if you used a half square on the corner units rather than the combo unit that we're going to be doing, then the T's emerge a little bit more clearly. I've also seen it with, instead of having a 4-patch in the center, just a solid square, and that also shows pretty clearly the double T variation. But we're going to be doing this version. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this block. First of all, this is a 9-patch block, and we're doing a 12-inch finished block. That means each of my units of my 9-patch have to finish at 4 inches. So say I decided I want to make this block to a 9-inch block. All I have to do is make sure that each of my sections finishes at 3 inches. I could even do this in a 6-inch block. The whole thing is a 6-inch block. These would just have to finish at 2 inches. That would mean that my flying geese finish at 1 by 2 inches. That is possible with the wing clipper tool. I even have had some ladies do this in a 3-inch finished block. The whole thing finished at 3 inches. That meant the flying geese had to finish at a 1/2 inch by 1 inch. The combo unit has to finish at a 1-inch finished combo. The hourglass unit in the center had to finish at a 1-inch hourglass unit. So that is a possibility. But I decided everything we're going to do in this particular series is going to be a 12-inch finished block. So by the way, say I'm making 8-inch blocks. This is not a good option because 3 doesn't divide evenly into 8 inches. So that's why I avoided the sizes that could not be easily divided into 12 inches. So that's why all of our blocks have to be a multiple of something that will be divided by, will be divided into 12. So we have several units to do. One thing we're going to do is a flying goose. We'll talk about that. One is an hourglass unit, and we've done some hourglass units in some previous blocks. And then we're also going to be doing the combo units, which is a half square on one side and quarter squares on the other side. So I'm going to show you the process for doing that, and I have actually done parts of the piecing ahead of time, so it won't take as long to demonstrate what we're doing. So I'm going to go back to the camera where the sewing machine is, and I'm going to start with the hourglass unit. So I have 2 squares because I want to finish, and I made a mistake, I'll tell you what it is in just a second. I want to finish with an hourglass unit that is 4 inches. That means my squares have to start 1.5 inches bigger than that. Now we've talked about that before. Chart. So we've talked about the chart that shows the hourglass unit. And over on the left side of the page, it says for hourglass or quarter square units, start with squares 1.5 inches larger than your finished size. We're actually going to do the first row and the third row in order to complete an hourglass unit. So that is something that you can also see on the Studio 180 Design website. Those charts are very handy. So here's the mistake I made. This is the wrong side of my fabric. There's the right side. I put it on there upside down. Some fabrics are so close that it's hard to tell which is which. So the first thing I do is draw my double lines, stitch across, and then I'm going to go ahead and pretend that I've sewn this correctly and show you the next process. So I would cut here, and then I would also turn that around, and I'm just going to do it real quick so you can see what I'm talking about. I would press that, and I would press it toward the darker fabric in this case. And I'm just going to give it a quick finger press because I'm not going to go through the whole process of this for you because I want to show you some other things. So I would, of course, sew it with the right sides together. And then when I put this together to do the cross seam, I want to make sure that I have my colors offset opposite each other so that I end up with that perfect hourglass unit. Now, the thing about this is the way you make this, starting with 1 blue square and 1 red square, I actually end up with 2 4-inch finished hourglass units. In this case, here's my extra one that I got when I did the sample that I showed you on the overhead camera. So I would follow that same process and I would do this particular unit and I would end up with 2 of my hourglass units. I only need 1 for the block. So of course I'm not going to toss this. I'm going to save it because I'm saving all of the pieces I'm demonstrating with. They'll eventually be made into blocks that can be used for Quilts of Honor or Quilts of Valor blocks. So that is the process for making the hourglass unit. That's a review from block 1 and block 2 in the Blockbuster series. So the next thing I need to do for my combo blocks, let's go back to that chart because I want you to notice this time we're going to do the first row and the second row. And this combo units also start with squares 1.5 inches larger than your finished unit. So on my unit, I have, let me grab one of them. We'll just put it back over here where you can see it easy. I have a combo unit that is blue on the large triangle, and then I have a red and a light blue small triangle on that combo unit. So I would need a square that's red that's 1.5 inches larger than my 4-inch finished unit. So I have a 5.5 inch square of red, a 5.5 inch square of my light blue, and then I need 2 5.5 inch squares of my dark blue. So that's what I have in my stack here. Unpin this so you can see. I've got my 2 squares of dark blue. I have a square of light blue and a square of red. And you can see that I did the same thing with this. I wasn't paying attention. I sewed the wrong side to the right side, and I would need to take this out and turn it around. I'm not going to do that right now because I'm going to skip on to the next part, but I wanted you to notice with the coloring of my block that I chose, I ended up needing two of these units that have a red square and a light blue square for the first step of my hourglass unit. That's also the same thing I start with for my combo unit. So we're just going to pretend that this is sewn correctly, and I'm going to go ahead and complete it. You really may not be able to tell as much because this is one of those fabrics that is almost the same color front and back. Some of the fabrics, the back side is very noticeably different. But here's the thing. You bought both sides, so if you want to use the back side of the fabric on the front of your quilt, there's nothing that says you can't. So I've got my pieces finger pressed, so I'm going to show you what the next step is. The first thing I have to do is go to the ironing station and press that half square. And if I was making something where I needed half squares, I would be ready to trim at this point. This is going to actually end up being my combo unit, so I have to press before I do the next step. So if you're using the acorn pressing pen, there is, this would be the time to use that. And you're just going to give it a swipe down the seam so that the acorn pressing solution just buries those seams down. So now I'm ready to go back to the sewing area. And if I was making the hourglass unit, I would be ready to just buddy those up and make sure I alternate those. But I'm making the combo unit. So I'm going to take my dark blue square and my half square that I've got, and I'm going to put right sides together. So make sure that your seam is on the back here. And notice that that half square unit is bigger than that blue square. Theoretically, I could cut this square a ½ inch smaller and it would still work. It's just more efficient to cut all three squares the same size, so you don't have to stop and figure out which one needs to be larger, which one needs to be smaller. So actually there's 4 squares involved because I need 2 of them, one for this half square and one for this half square. Now my next step is to take my Quilter's Magic Wand. It's buried underneath my computer here. And I'm going to draw my lines across that original seam. Now a couple of things to note. This size will not allow me to use my broken magic wand. Most of you, if you've been watching me very long, you know I broke this on purpose so that I'd have a shorter magic wand to use for my projects, because if I'm making smaller units, I don't necessarily want this much of my magic wand to have to deal with. So I just broke it in half. Now you can't see that, neither can I. Let me get a darker one. You could see it if it was actually the back side of the fabric, but since I've got my fabric turned the wrong way. So see, here's the deal. I make plenty of mistakes. I just don't always tell you when I do, but sometimes when I'm on camera, there's no avoiding it. So now I can see that better, and I need to do that with both of my units. I'm going to just lay it on here, and it actually doesn't have to be layered on my bigger square, my dark blue square, in order to draw my lines. I could actually just sit in my recliner and draw these lines on all of my half square units, getting them ready for the next step of making my combo units. So combo units are a great little thing to add pizzazz to your quilts. There's lots and lots of patterns on the market that use combo units. A lot of the patterns that I've designed and that Deb has designed use combo units. So they're a pretty handy unit to know. So I'm just stitching across on my line, and I'm going to grab the next one. Assembly line sewing is always more efficient, and since I have to do 2 of these in order to make my 4 corner units, I just do them one after the other. And now I'm going to stitch across the end and then come back the other way. My needle, nope, that. My needle was not in the automatic down position. If your machine has a feature to have the needle stop in the down position every time it stops, you want to engage that. It helps with, especially when you're doing assembly line piecing, because once you stop, your fabric stays where it needs to be so you can adjust or answer the phone or whatever. When you come back to it, it's still where it needs to be to continue stitching. So I'm going to park my needle in my fabric tag. I'm really sad that I can't see any comments. I hope there are a few, but my machine, for some reason, is not letting me see any. So make a few comments so that I know you're there, and I'll answer later. So now I'm going to go to a cutting surface, and you don't want to use your Quilter's Magic Wand as a cutting guide. It's not wide enough to protect my fingers. So I just grabbed whatever ruler's closest, but usually I have something close by. So there's a combo unit. And remember, you're pretending that this is the right side of the fabric. We're all pretending that, because I want to show you what the next step is. So I've got 4 combo units. We're going to go back to the overhead camera so you can see what it looks like to trim it. So my first step is to press those units. And I am going to press toward the larger triangle, but I also give it a quick little finger press. That way I can make sure my seam is going the way I want it to. I don't have any little tucks or pleats here in the edge that I'm not aware of. And I'm just going to give it a little bit of time under the needle, under the iron. Now I just quick finger press in between. And one more. Now, of course, we have talked a little bit about this, but just so you remember, you always have the option of changing your color combinations for the blocks that we're doing. When I post the different colors that I use, that it says to cut, that is related to what I cut when I made it, but yours doesn't have to include those same color combinations. In order to get the contrast where the pattern looks like the picture, you want the contrast to be the same. So if I have something light here and something dark here, you want to continue that unless you completely flip it and put your dark here and your light there, which is totally possible. And sometimes the blocks that you come up with are kind of a surprise, and they aren't necessarily what you thought you were going to start out with when you started the project. Okay, so now the next thing I'm going to do, just move this over a little bit, move our cutting mat. I'm going to be using the Tucker trimmer. So the really cool thing about the Tucker trimmer, we've done the hourglass units where it had 2 diagonal seams crossing over the center. We've done half squares where you just have 1 diagonal seam that you have to line up with. This has a diagonal seam here and a partial diagonal seam here. So I know that point needs to be where the 4.5-inch mark crisscrosses. Remember, this is a 4-inch finished unit, but that means I need to trim it to 4.5. So there's my 4.5-inch mark. I'm going to line up on the seams, and so I've got my 4.5-inch line here. My bold solid line goes there. I can see that I have just a little sliver all the way around to trim that up, so I get a perfect 4.5-inch square, and then when I'm ready to stitch that into my project, it will finish at 4 inches. notice that because my blue square was bigger than my half square, I'm actually having more of my blue, my dark blue, to trim away, but that just makes it line up so easily, and I don't have to fight with it and fuss with it to get the size I want. Now remember, the half sizes are based off of the half circle. All of those are 1.5, 2.5, 3.5, and so on. If I was cutting something to a whole size, I would use the whole circle, but that means it would finish at a 1/2 inch. So if I trimmed this to 4 inches, when I stitch it into my project, it would finish at 3.5. So you're trimming to a 1/2 inch bigger than your finished size, or yes, a 1/2 inch bigger than your finished size. So I'm lining up my bold line on one seam, the 4.5 inch line on the other seam, and where it meets in the middle, that's where the X of the lines on my Tucker trimmer need to meet. If you're left-handed, you're simply going to put this half circle icon in the top left corner of your unit. So there is the example of how you make a combo unit. Now I want you to notice something. When you make a combo unit, the traditional, the way that the instructions in the Tucker trimmer show you, you're going to end up with a mirror image, which is fine for the way this block is designed, because I can put this one here and this one here, and that is how this block is constructed. I'm going to just move my pieces a little closer. There is a way of making this where it's not a mirror image. That is a technique that we may use later. I can't remember if that's coming up anytime soon, but it is a technique sheet that's available from Studio 180 Design. We actually have those and use them quite a bit here in the shop. But that's how this part of the block is designed. Now, the flying geese, we did flying geese last week, and this is going to be done in the same manner that we did those. And I've actually done some of the sewing ahead of time, so I'm just going to kind of quick talk you through that and demonstrate trimming just so you can see what I did. So here is what I have to start with. My flying geese are all 2 inch by 4 inch finish. So I have a couple of them here already trimmed, and I have the other two stitched and ready to trim, but I wanted to kind of walk you through the process. This is the basic use of the wing clipper tool. Now you can also go to the instructions on the tool, or that come with your tool, that show you what to cut according to the size you want to make. I'm about to do it again. Flip that over so I can see the front side. So I also, on the sheets that you'll be downloading from me, tell you what size squares I need in order to make this a 2 by 4 finished goose. And here's a chart that might be helpful for you. You're going to start with your large square. This is written up in the top right corner. Start with a large square, 1.5 inches larger than the width of your goose. Here's the width of your goose. I realize now that I've got the needle where you can't, or the camera where you can't see it. There's the width of your goose, and there's the height of your goose. There's actually two laying here. But your big square starts with a square 1.5 inches larger than the width. Your small squares are 1 inch larger than the height. So that's how you determine. There's also a step that you don't want to forget when you're making your flying geese. If you see this instruction in the magazine or a book, they often will give me precise measurements, and they usually involve eighths and quarters and strange measurements I don't want to deal with. But then they're expecting that I'm going to sew it perfectly and it's going to come out right. On this, in order to accommodate that, you're going to leave 2 or 3 threads of this back square showing when you put the smaller square on top. And I actually start by layering my small square on the top corner, the corner that's going to go under the machine first. You could pin both of the pieces on here, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. I could pin that square on, and I could grab the other square and layer it on. Let me get this back where you can see it. I could layer it on and pin, and then start stitching. I find that I have better control if I only deal with one of my small squares at a time. So I'm going to layer this on, and I've got a little bit of my back square showing, just 2 or 3 threads, and I'm also not pinning. If you want to pin, that's perfectly fine. I've just gotten to where I don't pin on this step. I'm going to stitch a little more than halfway across my small square. And then this is a good place where you want your needle to stop in the down position, because it's keeping everything controlled while I put the second square on. And I put the second square on overlapping here in the center, and I want to leave about 2 or 3 threads of the back square showing here on the back corner as I'm stitching through. And I'm doing assembly line sewing again. So since my quilt had 2 different combinations, I'll show you in just a minute, I would have actually done both of my big squares. I would have done this process on both big squares, and then I would have done the next step. So I'm going to go across, and then I'm going to turn, stitch back the other way. The nice thing about the wing clipper tool is this is not the only size I can make with this tool. I have 10 size options that I can make with the wing clipper tool. So any pattern from any designer that falls within the half and whole inch measurements, you can do with your wing clipper. Now there is a wing clipper too. It's for unusual sizes that you just don't that don't occur very often in quilting, but they are available. So these are my 2 color options. On my flying geese, I have to have some geese that are dark with lighter wings, and some geese that are light with darker wings. And I just actually had an opposite color that I used. Yours may not be this color, but in order to do this, I had to have a large red square and 4 small blue squares, and I had to have a large blue square and 4 small red squares. So that's how I ended up with the color combination I needed. So now I have this stitched on. I've got my 2 small squares stitched onto the large square. Again, you don't want to use your quilter's magic wand to cut this apart. I'm just going to cut across so that I'm ready to press. So I'm going to the overhead camera, and I'll show you what comes next, and then I'm going to demonstrate trimming so that you see what we're going to do. I have lost my little squares. There they are. So I have my wing clipper ready, and I'm going to press toward the smaller triangle. I give it a little finger press first just to control those seams so I know which way they need to go. I'm just going to finger press that and grab my iron and hit that with the iron. This is where I would use my acorn pressing pin. Just give it a quick little swipe. And then I'm ready for the next step. I'm going to show you what the next step would be, and I'm going to skip over a little bit of it. The next thing you will do is take this shape and put your other small squares on and stitch them. Again, you're going to leave a space, 2 or 3 threads here on the outside edge of this darker fabric or the back fabric, and then when you stitch and then follow the leader, stitch again, stitch across the bottom, and then go back the other way. Once you do that, that gives you your 4 flying geese units, and you just cut down the center. So this is what it looks like. It's a little oversized, It's a little wonky, but that's the way we like it because now I can take my wing clipper tool and I can trim this to the size I'm after. And remember, this is a 2" by 4" finished goose, but that means I'm going to trim it a ½ inch bigger than that to 2½ by 4½ inches. And I'm going to always put this long diagonal, this common diagonal line is going on the right seam. Then the line that matches up to that 2½ by 4½ inch rectangle, that line's going on my left seam since that's my size. Whatever size I need, those lines are here to go on this left seam. If I'm left-handed, I'm going to point the goose to the right and I'm going to turn my tool vertically. This long diagonal is still going to go on the right seam and then this line's going on the left seam. So once I get that ready, I'm going to line up the long diagonal. I'm not going to try to do it left-handed. I have just a tiny sliver around my rectangle, my flying goose rectangle, to trim away. And you can see I just had a few threads and the corner to cut off there. Then I'm going to turn 180 degrees. The 4½ by 2½ inch lines line up on the cut edges. And once I get that cut, that's going to protect my seam allowance at the tip so I don't lose off the beak of my goose. And I'm going to do that with all 8 of my flying geese. And then once I get that done, I'm ready to stitch them together. And remember, when you stitch them together, I'll show you that, you want to stitch them so that you can see as much as possible the intersection where the goose crisscrosses. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. So I've got a couple that are ready to stitch. We're going to go back to the sewing area so you can see what I'm talking about. So here's my geese. And I want to stitch them where they're following each other. There we go. So I want to stitch them where they're following each other, but if I flip this over, I can't see that intersection that's underneath here. Sometimes you have no choice but to stitch it that way just because of what you're stitching together. But if I flip it over where I can see that intersection, where those 2 stitching lines, I don't know if I can get it in the light where you can see it, where the 2 stitching lines crisscross, that's where I want to aim my needle so that I come to a nice sharp point. So if I've trimmed it properly, that's going to be 1/4 inch from the edge anyway. So I'm just going to get to there and then I'm going to stitch right over that. And notice I didn't pin anything. If you feel like you have to, go right ahead. That's not a problem. I just tend not to pin very much because it slows me down. So I've got my double goose stitched together and I have the appropriate amount of seam allowance there, but I've got a nice sharp point of my goose. Then I want to press toward the direction they're going. So since they're going north right now, I'm going to press that direction. So that is how you're going to put your geese together. And eventually I will put all of my pieces together for my double T or capital T variation. And then when you decide to put that together, you want to kind of pay attention to where the placement is. Because it is possible to stitch this together and then it doesn't look like the picture. Let me show you how you would do that. Because of the T that is kind of split in half, if I switch these 2, you could do that if you want to, but it looks even less like a T when you do that. But there's nothing that says you can't do it that way. You could also flip your pieces around and make a whole different block. So you can put your pieces together however you want. The whole idea behind these blockbuster patterns is to play with these shapes and create interesting patterns using those. So that's kind of an interesting pattern in and of itself. And it's totally different than the capital T variation that the picture had when I started. So that is capital T variation, and that's our block for today. I'll be sending an email that has a link to the Google Docs file where I store the instructions for what you cut. It also will have a link to Studio 180 Design website where you can download the Blockbuster pattern for the capital T variation. So look for that. Come see the new fabrics we have in the shop. We probably got 40 or 50 bolts of fabric, and this is only Tuesday. So since last week, we've got quite a few bolts of fabric. And then check out the classes that we have coming up, and we'd love to have you come and join us. I'll be looking later and seeing what comments I need to answer. If you have questions and I didn't address it during the video, just give us a call or put a comment later, because those all show up as well. So until next week, happy sewing. We'll be doing block number 5 next week. Bye-bye.